Thanks everyone for coming, especially on this hot day, but I'm sure you're glad to be inside. And glad to be inside in what an appropriate talk, mountain snowpacks, right? You got to just feel cooler looking at that picture there, right? You know, I do at least. When I walked in there and I see snow, I feel a lot cooler, right? But we're here for the Nevada Climate Change Seminar Series that we run as part of the NSF EPSCoR project. And this is an ongoing seminar series. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Tom Pihota at UNLV here. I'm one of the principal investigators on this project. This is one of our outreach components of the project where we bring in a variety of different speakers, some of those involved with the project, some from outside the project also. And we're really fortunate this month to have Arlen Huggins, who I'll introduce here in a minute, to talk about some of the ongoing research that he's doing. So I'll go ahead and introduce Mr. Huggins. Mr. Huggins majored in physics at Kansas State University. He has a meteorological background doing graduate studies in atmospheric science at Colorado State University. He has a lot of experience, so you're talking to probably one of the leaders in this field. Over 30 years of experience in research on various aspects of cloud seeding and weather modification, so we're really fortunate to have him here today. He's worked on field research and operational projects in mountains of California, Nevada, Utah, Idaho, Colorado, Wyoming, and Australia. In fact, he just came back from Wyoming yesterday, so we're really glad that he's able to make it here. Evaluating the potential of cloud seeding using both ground-based and remote sensing instruments. He's done work for U.S. Bureau of Reclamation, NOAA projects. I know he works with the Southern Nevada Water Authority too, looking at both the ground-based and airborne. He's currently an associate research scientist at the Desert Research Institute, and he heads up their program and he's their program manager for DRI's cloud seeding program. So with that, please join me in welcoming Mr. Arlen Huggins.
Thank you very much. And that was the intention of this first slide, was to make us all feel cool, like it's 10 degrees Fahrenheit outside, and well, that was 110. Very happy to be here and address a group somewhat different than what I normally talk to in my specific areas of research. I hope you get a feel for how this process works, how it is so important in areas like Nevada, where we have water shortages and all of our water basically comes from snowpacks. Climate is not my area, but I have read enough to know what some of the trends have been past and what some of the models are saying might be in store for us in the future. So I'm going to present a little bit of that to put the talk on snowpacks in context. And then talk a little bit about specific things like warming's effect on the hydrologic cycle and how it may be affecting precipitation in snowpack, in addition to critical elements like snow melt evaporation and the resultant stream flow. And I'll probably spend the most time, since this group probably isn't as well versed in how cloud seeding works, but talking about cloud seeding and how we use it to augment snowpacks and ultimately stream flow. Some of the concepts and research we've done that dates back at least 50 years, and some of the ongoing research. Some of the potential feasibilities that have been studies that have been done in the upper Colorado Basin, which is of critical importance to Southern Nevada water and Las Vegas water. And then point out how this is being employed operationally in projects in the Western U.S., and then drop back again to the Colorado River Basin and say a little bit about what's going on in Colorado, Utah, Wyoming, how there is currently some interaction between the upper and lower basin states on not only operational projects but research, and try to sum all that up in what may be happening relative to climate change, how cloud seeding may be used to mitigate some things that are happening, may or may not be able to mitigate some things that are happening. It's a slide I stole from my colleague Kelly Redmond at DRI. I stole several slides in this presentation as they relate to climate, but this you've probably seen before, and this is pertinent to the upper Colorado River Basin itself, annual mean temperature, starting in, just before 1900, and this graph culminates just before 2010, but the upward trend in average temperature is obvious, and in particular, since about 1970, about a 2-degree rise in annual temperature. And then Kelly looked at the same period of time, but in average precipitation across the upper Colorado Basin, where the blue represents the annual, and then the red is an 11-year running mean. Well, the obvious thing from this graph is the variability, and I think we all knew that in terms of precip or snowfall, huge variability year to year, but you can also see some trends in the data that show both wet periods and extended dry periods. Kelly's conclusion from this was the overall trend in more than 100 years was there is little trend in average precipitation. However, if you look solely at snowpack and what's been happening, say, over the last 50 years, and this was from a paper by Moda et al., I believe it was 2006, 5 or 6, showed how snowpacks have either increased or declined in the western United States, where the size of the circle represents the percentage increase or decrease, where reds are decreases and blues are increases. So the bigger the circle, the bigger the increase, and smaller the increase. So we see in the, there's kind of a dividing line in latitude somewhat, that the regions in the Sierra down to the southern Sierra have all seen decreases. The mountains in Montana, Idaho also decreases, but smaller ones. And then in the upper Colorado, in the higher terrain, we've actually seen some increases, the same in Utah, but relatively small ones. So in looking at this and looking at the temperature change over the same period, if warming's having an impact, it's most likely that these decreases in this region may be not so much a change in precip, but a change from rainfall or from snowfall to rainfall, and that we're getting higher snow levels, more of it's falling on rain in the lower slopes, even during the winter months, whereas in the higher terrain like the southern Sierra and the mountains of Colorado, that's not such an impact because more of the snow load is at a colder temperature at higher elevation, and so we just may not be seeing the change from the shift from snow to rain at the higher elevations. So what are some of the possibilities? There was a bulletin of the American Meteorological Society paper in 2005 that emphasized this decline in snowpack, which the models suggested were mainly due to warming. So if the trend in warming continues, these snowpack losses could continue. And as I pointed out on the previous one, the losses were not as noticeable in the higher terrain in the upper Colorado Basin. Some of the more current models suggest, as I think I've indicated also, that total precip may not be changing, but climate models, it's very difficult to delineate things on a regional scale. So if we're off by a couple degrees latitude, you may have more snow, more precip versus less snow, less precip. And that's a difficult one to predict on a smaller scale. However, regardless, if temperature continues to increase, then stream flow will still likely decrease just through the warming effect. If you get the same amount of water running off the mountain, but it's warmer, the evaporative effect is going to be greater. And so that is decreasing stream flow at the same time that you may not see any change in snowpack at all. So if that is the case, then you would need an increase in precipitation to offset just the warming effect or the evaporative effect. Other possibilities that have been pointed out in recent reports that the warming trend may not only continue on an average basis, but the intensity of wet periods, because there's basically more energy in storms, the intensity of wet periods, and this is often pointed to in the intensity of hurricanes and other weather phenomena, these may be increasing due to the warming. And the drying periods may also be more intense because it's a warmer atmosphere, and so again, the evaporation may be, evapotranspiration and evaporation may be increased, so that exacerbates the drought periods we have. And the other point I mentioned before, rainfall may actually increase while snowfall decreases at the lower elevations. And with the warming, and we've seen this in the trends over the last couple of decades, snowmelt is occurring sooner. And it's also occurring faster, so there's a more rapid spring warm-up. And this presents a big problem for water managers if they're not ready for that water to come down the stream. And potentially an even bigger problem for agriculture if their crops aren't ready to use that water and they have no way of storing it. So agriculture in places as far away as the California Central Valley and just local agricultural interests, if the water's running off too fast and you can't make use of it, then it's basically lost to the system. And so the last point that I'll eventually try to cover is, can wintertime cloud seeding mitigate any of these changes that climate change may be bringing about? So again, since your background probably hasn't crossed paths with cloud seeding and weather mod too many times, I'll go into this in a bit of detail. The conceptual model for winter cloud seeding and the past research we've used to test that model and develop it, continue to develop it. Some current research activities which consist of randomized experiments. People always ask me, well, how do you show if cloud seeding is doing something or it's not doing something? If you seed a cloud, how would you know what would have happened if you didn't seed it? Well, you do experiments just like you do in agriculture. You have a treated and an untreated sample, or in the medical profession, and you hone in on a specific set of cloud circumstances, and you try to validate that those circumstances exist or those conditions exist. And these are ones where we know cloud seeding can potentially have an effect. And then, okay, say we're going to design this experiment so we have 5-hour seeding blocks. And when the conditions for a storm meet our criteria, we're going to randomly choose to seed that particular storm or not seed that storm. And so that's one way of doing it. But with the variability in weather, even though you confine your experiments to a certain set of conditions, it still is quite variable, and it still takes a long time, many years of data, to get enough cases that will be statistically significant when you eventually analyze them. So then the other types of experiments involve physical case studies, physical measurements. Seed a cloud, measure the ice crystal concentration, measure the snow that's falling on the ground. And if you do that in a very detailed case study way, you can also learn enough to actually verify the steps in your conceptual model. And then what's been happening a lot more recently, maybe in the last 10 years, is if you know you can put a certain number of inches of snow on the ground, how do you know what effect you're going to have in stream flow? And so a lot of projects, and some of the current ones in particular, have been using hydrologic modeling to take that the next step. You increase snowpack by, or snow water content by a few inches. How does that affect stream flow? And now I'll talk a little bit about some of the operational projects that are going on in the Western U.S. and focus again on ones in the Colorado River Basin, Colorado, Wyoming, Utah, and talk also about some of these upper basin, lower basin interactions. So here's a diagram of the sort of the concept of how cloud seeding works. So my title, Silver Solution, you have a solution of silver iodide that's dissolved in acetone that's kept in what we call a cloud seeding generator. And you pressurize it in a container and feed this solution up to just a regular furnace burner that's burning propane as a fuel, spray the solution into the flame, vaporize it, and then as the vaporized product leaves your generator, it recondenses into these microscopic particles of silver iodide. And these are very small, invisible to the eye. They're approximately a tenth of a micron in size. And as opposed to the TV stations that like to say we're shooting it into the atmosphere, well, it just drifts like smoke out of a chimney would. But we put it in locations like on ridges, minor ridges, that have substantial airflow. So what's taking the material into the cloud, which is kind of shown by these arrows, is just the natural flow of the air over the barrier and the turbulence that mixes it vertically into the cloud. Now, one of the key elements of mixing or diffusing it into cloud is that it has to reach the -5 level. And that's where silver iodide becomes active as an ice nucleant. Now, there's a lot of materials in the atmosphere that can produce ice, but they're generally active at much colder temperatures, like below -15 centigrade. So if you have a cloud system that has cirrus altostratus at temperatures of -30, -40, that's probably going to be a pretty efficient cloud because it's going to have plenty of ice nuclei and plenty of ice. And that ice is going to settle down through the lower cloud and grow and collect water. And that cloud, that type of cloud, has very little potential for cloud seeding. But if you have a cloud system where the tops are warmer than about -15, and you can get the material into that cloud on the leading edge above this -5 level, then you can produce ice where it may not be producing ice on its own. So that's sort of the second phase of the project. You release the material into cloud, you form ice in the leading edge of the cloud. And in order for cloud seeding to have any effect, you have to have cloud drops in that cloud which haven't frozen, and they're super cooled. They're below freezing, but they're still liquid. And water can exist this way. If there's no impurity, a cloud drop can stay as liquid down to -40 centigrade. And then it will freeze in what we call a homogeneous nucleation process. It will just freeze naturally. But one of the key elements for cloud seeding is that the cloud still contains supercooled liquid and it hasn't completely iced out. So once the ice particle forms in this part of the cloud, it's going to start growing, and once that happens, the cloud seeding process there's no difference between cloud seeding and a natural process. It's going to acquire water vapor from the air, or it's going to bump into cloud drops and grow that way. But that's how natural snowfall grows. And if it acquires enough mass, then it's going to overcome the updraft that's lifting it into the cloud and fall on the higher elevation of snow, and that's the process that we want to accomplish. If this cloud were untreated, this relatively warm cloud were untreated, these supercooled drops would basically flow over the mountain like the dark arrow is suggesting and pretty much evaporate on the downwind side. So that's the inefficiency of the process. The water coming in on one side, if it isn't turned to ice where it grows and falls out of snow, is going to evaporate on the downwind side. And that's my view from Reno, is that evaporation process on the downwind side of the Sierra. It's very effective in a lot of storms. So just sort of reiterating the concepts in text, you have to be able to produce a type of seeding material reliably, and we found silver iodide to be a very effective one. You need to transport it to the clouds, and this might seem like a simple thing, but before the advent of some of the instrumentation we use now, you never knew where it was going. So you had to confirm the transport and dispersion process, that you're actually getting into the clouds upwind of the target area when you want to create snow. And then again in red, clouds have to contain supercooled liquid water drops. So then you don't want to just create one little tiny narrow plume stripped through the cloud, because that's not going to create a whole lot of extra precipitation. So you usually use more than one seeding generator and do some experiments that shows you're affecting a significant volume of the cloud and not just a small portion of it, so that you're not only getting the silver iodide dispersed throughout the cloud, but then you're also enhancing the ice crystal concentration in the whole cloud volume and not just a small part of it. And then I mentioned that before, we have to get silver iodide above the -5 level. Other materials are used. Initially, dry ice was used as a seeding agent. It's very bulky. It's hard to get into a cloud from the ground. Throwing doesn't work real well. So a lot of people dropped it from an airplane, but it's pretty heavy, so you can't carry a whole lot of it. And that's one of the reasons why silver iodide is used more often than dry ice. And then the crystals have to reside in the cloud long enough that they can grow and fall out. And so if you have a high wind speed and a very narrow mountain barrier, they may not reach sizes big enough, and they may also sublimate on the downwind side if they haven't grown big enough. So some of the past research we've done, we've looked at a wide variety of substances for their ice nucleating properties. And some of the original experiments done in the GE labs in New York first used dry ice. And then a man named Vince Schaefer researched his handbook of chemistry and physics and was looking for a material that matched the lattice structure of ice, and found out that silver iodide, in fact, is almost identical to ice, the molecular lattice structure. And we think that's probably why it's such a good ice nucleating agent. Looked at a lot of different iodides. The Russians even tried lead iodide and a few other very harmful chemical elements. But in terms of production and how you can create very tiny ice nuclei out of it, silver iodide has worked pretty well. And then the whole transport and dispersion problem, we developed instruments that you can fly through a cloud and actually detect the silver iodide in cloud. And it's just a miniature cloud chamber that pulls the silver iodide into the chamber, creates miniature ice particles in the cloud chamber that fall out, and you just count the ice crystals. And you'll get a sudden enhancement in this ice crystal counts from the cloud chamber when you fly through a plume. So you can actually fly this back and forth, or take a mobile van and drive it back and forth through a plume over a mountain and actually measure where the plume resides, how wide it is. And with an airplane, you can also see how high above the mountain range it's getting. So we map plumes with both aircraft and mobile platforms. And then when cloud models got to where you could run them relatively quickly, you could create plume dispersion models just like they do in air pollution studies and predict where cloud seeding plumes are going to go. Did a lot of work with supercooled liquid water measurements, aircraft sensors, mountaintop icing sensors, and microwave radiometers, which allow you to monitor supercooled liquid and cloud remotely. And then we looked at the seeding-induced, or what we call microphysical changes in the cloud, the actual process of forming an ice crystal and how that occurs and how the ice crystals grow in time and whether they get big enough to fall out on the ground. So we've done most of that with aircraft measurements, and we've done some of it with mobile ground-based measurements, carrying the same type of instrumentation, but driving over high mountain roads in cloud where you're actually driving through the silver iodide plume or the cloud seeding plume, but you're still in a mobile system. Not to say that one is any more or less safe than the other. And then a lot of new ground-based remote sensing in instrumentation, including these radiometers, microwave radars, and I'll show you some of these newer ones that are mounted on airplanes and allow us to detect not only ice in clouds, but wind flow in clouds, turbulence in clouds, and all sorts of neat stuff. And then what a lot of the work that DRI has done is trace chemistry. We collect snow samples from the target areas and analyze them for metals, trace metals. And since silver is in our seeding material, we analyze the snow for silver and take a profile in the snow and analyze it for silver, and you actually see the layers in the snow where the seeded snowfall fell out. And then looking at the seeding-induced changes in precipitation and snowfall at the surface. And statistically, we do these in the randomized experiments and comparing a large set of seeded cases versus a large set of non-seeded cases, which has the greater precipitation, or the ratio of the two, which has the, is it showing an enhancement or not, and are there enough cases to show statistical significance. And then detailed case studies rely more on flying through a cloud, knowing where the plume is, comparing the ice crystal characteristics on either side of the plume with the ice crystal characteristics in the plume. And I'll show you some data which shows that the signal is very strong when you're right in the plume, but when you modulate that signal within the context of a large winter storm, it's harder, much harder to detect on the ground and show the evidence that you're actually increasing snowfall. This is a plot from a project in Australia that shows how we monitor all these cloud conditions in real time. The top one is actually showing a snowfall analysis, silver, and the element indium, which they were releasing in this experiment. Coincidentally, they had two identical cloud seeding generators. One released a compound of indium and one released a compound silver iodide. Indium's not an ice nucleator, but silver is. So when you look in the snow downwind and you see a much higher ratio of the mass of silver to indium, it's an indication that you're not just scavenging the particles out, you're actually creating more particles by ice nucleation, thereby getting more silver into the snow than indium. And this is work that DRI actually originated probably about 20 years ago. So then we have some radiometer data here in this panel. This time scale is about 2 days. And so here's radiometer data showing how liquid water changes in the cloud over time from peaks and valleys, and all these gray areas is where they were actually conducting their randomized seeding experiments. So typically you would see radiometer liquid in each one of those periods where they were seeding. This is data from an icing sensor, just a little probe that if supercooled water hits it, the water will freeze on the probe, and the little guy is vibrating at a certain frequency, and as that frequency changes, it will trip a circuit that heats the tip, melts the ice off, and you can actually tell the icing rate from the frequency of the heat cycle. So this diagram here in the middle is showing the data from that icing sensor and showing ice was accumulating throughout most of the periods of their seeding experiments, except for this last one where there was a fair amount of radiometer data but not much mountaintop icing, which probably means cloud base was just above the top of the mountain, so it wasn't, icing sensor wasn't being impacted, but the radiometer can still sense it from the ground. And then we look at precipitation in real time, which are these two plots of accumulation. And here's where you run into this variability issue. So you can see the first experiment they did, very light precipitation. Next one had a little more. The third one was quite productive in terms of precip. Third one not so much. And the last one, again, very light precipitation. So this is the reason for this randomization process when you have this kind of variability and the fact that you need a lot of these cases. This experiment, they actually collected, I think it was 105 cases of seed, no seed pairs, and then analyzed the results after 5 years of experimenting. This is one that DRI did on a project on the Wasatch Plateau in Utah, where we're validating where the seeding plume goes. So we meaning there were many collaborators, but one group was flying an airplane through the cloud over the top of the plateau, and these green areas show where they were intercepting the plume. So they would fly passes that they knew they should be intersecting it, and then they would plot the data where they actually found the plume. And then the blue dots here show where we had a mobile system that had the same instrumentation, showed where they were intercepting the plume. So that if you connect the endpoints, that's the red lines, and that shows you basically the dimension of the plume and where it moved over the mountain barrier. And then we had precip gauges, which are these little circles, clear circles with a cross. And some of them were in the plume, and then we had ones out here that were outside the plume. And so for the course of this experiment, we would compare the precip data in the plume versus on the edges or outside the plume. So in this way, we're able to show if there was ice crystal enhancement, because some of the instruments actually counted and sized the crystals. And then we could also tell inside or outside the plumes whether we were increasing precipitation or not. This is one plot from one aircraft pass through that same plume. So this is a plan view showing the aircraft track flying basically south to north. This hatched region is where they intercepted the plume. And then on this scale is just the data on either side of where they intercepted the plume plotted in time. The bottom one shows where the plume was, and that's the red peak. That was actually a tracer gas, show where they intercepted the plume. And so the plume is bounded by these two red dash bars, and that's shown on each of the other plot. So the next one up is ice crystal concentration measured by a laser imaging probe. So it's fairly clear that the ice crystal concentration within the plume was quite enhanced compared to the background on either side of the plume. This is liquid water concentration, supercooled liquid, and it's showing some depletion in the plume, but the variability on either side is somewhat similar, which leads some of the, again, some of the verification that this ice was coming from seeding this batch of cloud water. So this was just one pass from that day. There were probably about 12 different passes, all showing similar results. So this is the verification of the sort of the second phase of our conceptual model. You are actually increasing ice crystal concentrations in cloud. And then we had a small wavelength radar on the project, and this is, again, this is the same plume. This is where the aircraft intercepted that plume, and this shows the plume of ice, so you get a spatial sense of how that plume of ice was spreading across the mountain. And if it's producing radar echo, then generally the ice crystals are large enough to fall out. So there should also be a signal in the precipitation data beneath this radar echo. And in fact, that's what we found. We found gauges on either edge of the plume with much less precip than gauges exactly in the plume. So that was probably done in the 90s. And then we had a gap in our research. And until recently, there hasn't been a lot of additional research in weather modification for snowfall. But I referred to this Australian Snowy Mountain project funded by the Australian government and the Snowy Hydro Power Company. It was a 5-year study, randomized study with a single target. In other words, they always seeded the same target randomly, either, I shouldn't say seeded, they either did or they didn't, but on a random basis. They just published the results last year, and it showed a statistically significant, which means there was only about a 5% chance that the results were in error, that there was a 14% increase in their target area precipitation for seeded events. And we were also simultaneously doing this trace chemistry assessment of this project, where we took snow samples and looked across their target area for evidence that the seeding material was getting there. And in fact, that was a very definitive study that showed both the validation with the chemistry results and the statistical results of the precipitation increases. University of Wyoming did an airborne radar study where they were the first to show on a spatial basis, not just one plume like I was showing you before, but over a whole bunch of different seeding experiments, looking at the cloud from above from a downward pointing radar and mapping the results for periods where there was seeding going on and not seeding going on, and showing an enhancement in the radar signal in the lowest part of the cloud where you would expect the seeding effect to be occurring. And that was just completed and published last year also. This was data I was referring to that we used to validate using trace chemistry. So this is another temporal plot from one of the Australian experiments. This is the period where they were actually conducting seeding. And then since there's a delay in how long it takes to create the ice and for it to fall out, they evaluated it over a period starting at about an hour later. So this is the evaluation period. And they were collecting snow samples at the center of their target, temporal samples. So each one of these bars represents one snow sample in time. And this whole period is not quite 24 hours, about 18 hours, I guess. In between these is 6 hours. So this is, they were doing 5-hour seeding blocks. So about an hour after they started seeding, we see a first enhancement in silver, and it just keeps climbing up to the midpoint of their seeding period, and then almost as soon as they stopped seeding within the evaluation period, everything dropped back down to below baseline. And since you were seeding enhancement in indium as well as silver, a priori, even before they released the seeding decision, we were pretty sure this was a seeded event, and in fact it was. So this was a classic case of validating the response to seeding in the snowpack using trace chemistry. The Wyoming project was currently ongoing. It has 2 more years to go. They use a dual target type of experiment where they have 2 target areas and they randomly seed one or the other. They're fairly close to one another. You need to have similar terrain. You have to have both of them being affected by the same weather system at the same time. And when those conditions are met, they decide randomly whether to seed one or the other. It's called a crossover experiment. And then at the end of this experiment, they compare the seeded target results from the unseeded target results. So for every seeded experiment, you really get a pair of numbers. You get the seeded mountain range and the unseeded mountain range. So that's what they call an experimental unit, is that pair of values, and then they compare the ratio of those 2 values. They're looking to get 200 units. In order to be able to detect a fairly small signal, like a 10% increase, that's why they need so many units, and to be statistically significant at the 5% level. So there's very little margin that could occur by chance. And then DRI is also doing the targeting environmental analysis using the trace chemistry techniques. And I say environmental analysis because when you mention that you're putting a heavy metal into the snowpack, whether it's silver iodide or not, people worry about its impact on the environment, its impact on water. But the nice thing about silver iodide is it's not how much you put in, it's how many particles you put in. So our seeding generators release about 25 grams an hour of silver iodide. Silver iodide is a compound that's almost insoluble in water. So it doesn't dissolve in water. So silver ion doesn't dissociate from the silver iodide and become free silver, which would be much more harmful. But then the total concentration is minute. We're looking at detecting the element in the snow in parts per trillion. And we found that the average through the snowpack is probably only 5 or 6 parts per trillion. In an individual layer, you might find 40 or 50, but throughout the snowpack, very small concentrations. Well, you find that amount more than that in water and especially in soil. So we're not adding to silver in any significant way in either water or soil. And since it's insoluble, it's not being taken up by aquatic species, and it's generally not being taken up by plants or animals to any extent that they would be harmful. They have a very unique modeling system going on in the Wyoming project. National Center for Atmospheric Research is doing that. Developed some new techniques of actually creating a simulation of seeding in their model. So for every one of these randomized experiments, they can run the model. Not every one of them, it takes way too long to run this thing, but for individual case studies, they can compare what actually happens to what the model was predicting, and that's quite a new development. And then one of the contractors is doing hydrologic modeling to assess the impact of seeding on stream flow in the North Platte River Basin, which is where the experiment is being conducted. And then finally, I mentioned before this Wyoming aircraft study that found a signal from seeding in their downward pointing radar data. This is what their airplane looks like. Quite a sophisticated instrument system with not only a down-pointing radar, but also a downward-pointing LiDAR, a suite of probes that can measure ice crystal concentrations and sizes, and aerosol components down to microscopic sizes. Modeling results, this shows the generators are located here. You can't see the terrain very well, but they plot a trajectory of the seeding plume from these modeling cases. The shaded area shows where the cloud water is developed, so they can see in the model where the silver iodide should be interacting with the cloud water. This is what a microwave radiometer looks like. It's about the size, looks like, and is about the size of a mailbox. And it can infer from frequency measurements, it can infer temperature, humidity, and cloud liquid using these different frequency channels. Some of the practical things that are used, the top left is dry ice being dispensed from the bottom of an airplane. The middle one is the typical silver iodide generator. That's the propane flame. It's where the silver iodide is burned. If it's released by aircraft, it uses a similar burner, but it's mounted on the underside of a wing, or the compound is burned in a flare similar to a road flare and released in cloud. This is seeding using liquid propane. Some experiments done in Utah, rather than burn the propane, they just released it from a nozzle, and the expansion out of the nozzle cools the air to about minus 70 degrees right in front of the nozzle. If the nozzle's in cloud, you just create a plume of ice right out of the nozzle. So we've pretty much verified the links to this conceptual model that we've been trying to do. We've shown the enhancements in ice crystals and precipitation through these detailed physical studies. And several of the statistical evaluations have shown positive evidence of precipitation enhancement. And we've also revealed a lot of situations, and this is always part of the research, of where cloud seeding is going to do you no good. Temperature's not cold enough, you don't have supercooled liquid water, the wind's blowing too hard, you don't have time to grow, all these different areas where cloud seeding is not going to work. So there's still a lot to be learned in this field. This is all the areas of the West that are currently conducting wintertime cloud seeding. Colorado, Utah, California, Nevada, Idaho has several projects, and these are the projects that are ongoing in Wyoming. All these other ones are either rain enhancement or hail suppression projects in the plain states. Utah's projects, and I'll point these out because they're related to the Colorado River Basin. They seed the Uinta Mountains, and they seed the Wasatch Plateau, which is somewhere down in here. That water either drains into the Green or the Colorado, contributes. These are Colorado projects. Got one here on the Grand Mesa, the San Juans, which either drain into the San Juan River, which eventually goes into the Colorado. This drains into either the Colorado or the Gunnison. And then in the upper Colorado, several projects either operated by ski areas, or Denver Water operates a project up in here. Denver Water would just as soon it not get to the Colorado River, but because they pipe it to the east slope. But some of that water gets to the Colorado River. Some feasibility studies that were done on snowfall and augmentation in the entire basin, and trying to show what might be possible in terms of augmentation. And the blue areas just show the main mountain ranges where augmentation might be possible and how many inches. You can't see the shading, and I'm not going to go into that detail, but 3 different studies showed maybe 1.3 to 1.9 million acre feet possible, 0.6 to 1 million, again 0.6 to about 1.5. And that's just if you took the snowpack and augmented it by X number of inches. That's how, and then they used a runoff model to see what that would end up being in additional runoff. So if you look at stream flow, kind of the bottom line on the Colorado River, and this is an observed and a reconstruction. The details of that aren't important. All I wanted to show was the temporal variability in stream flow in the Colorado is measured at Lee's Ferry. See, it oscillates about around 15 million acre feet. This is the period where cloud seeding was being conducted in Colorado, and you can see some obvious variations there. Well, the impact of cloud seeding, currently the way it's done in Colorado is not going to change the big cycles in runoff or precipitation on the Colorado River, but I just wanted to show in context of what you'd be working with throughout history. And generally, if you're in a drought period, seeing very little runoff, you don't have enough storms to do cloud seeding to any appreciable extent and bring you out of a drought. In a lot of ways, you can't do cloud seeding in a big wet year either, because a lot of states regulate the amount of snow that you can have on your mountains before you have to suspend seeding. So you're never going to have a big impact in either a real wet year or a real dry year. And your impact is probably going to be mainly in the middle of this diagram, where you have somewhat below or somewhat above average snowpack and runoff. So just looking at maybe potential versus reality, this 6 to 10% potential from cloud seeding would require a program comprehensively targeting all those different areas I showed on the map of the upper Colorado. The current program, and it would also require probably a greater than 10% enhancement in snowfall if you were going to really realize a 10% enhancement in runoff. And with warming occurring with climate change, that's particularly true. The other thing about what's currently going on is these projects are motivated by local regional water entities, and they're not so much interested in what gets to the Colorado. They want to know what gets into their specific water holding reservoir or water district reservoir. Like the Grand Mesa project, that's where Grand Junction get its water. They want to fill the reservoirs on the mesa. Now, some of that is going to get to the Colorado River, but there's a lot of diversions between where the seeding is done, the runoff, and the flow into the Colorado. So what the climate trends suggest, it's not going to significantly improve drought period just because you don't have enough opportunities and you aren't going to put that much additional snow to bring anybody out of a drought. And then I mentioned the wet years are kind of regulated by state agencies. If you have a 10% reduction in stream flow just due to the warming effect, that is where cloud seeding may have an offsetting tendency or mitigating effect in adding the snow to the upper parts of the Colorado River Basin in those years where you're reducing stream flow by not that much. Warming, just because of the height of the terrain, is probably not going to decrease the seeding opportunities in the Colorado Rockies just because they're so high. You're lifting it way above the -5 level. That's not true necessarily in the Sierra Nevada because their mountains much lower, particularly in the northern Sierra, and you may over time be finding less and less cloud seeding opportunities. Cloud seeding is probably not going to do much about the early onset of runoff. It's going to occur when it's going to occur. And if you put a little extra snow on the barrier, you may prolong that runoff period a little bit, but I wouldn't think you're going to significantly changing the whole period of runoff. And one other caveat, you see these averages and these trends. Well, it's just like precipitation. Cloud seeding is driven by conditions in a given winter. and these are going to go up and down just like you see the variations in snowfall. So you can't really tell anything by average warming. You're going to have a cold winter, you're going to have some great opportunities. You're going to have a warm winter or a dry winter, and you're not. So to say that those opportunities are going to gradually decrease or increase, we're probably not going to see that really well in just because of that large variability winter to winter. So summing up, probably taking too long. The researchers who do climate change seem to think that warming is likely to continue, and it's likely to, over the long term, decrease stream flow in the Colorado River Basin. Upper basin cloud seeding could make up for some of that deficit in winters that are not really wet or not really dry. But if you're a little above average, a little below average, you're going to have a lot of opportunities, much better opportunities to increase that. And those are the years, if you have the capability of banking that water in a reservoir, that's where you need to make up the deficits for later dry years. Effectiveness, as I pointed out, in the high terrain of the upper basin, probably not going to be changed a lot by gradual warming, just because of the cold temperatures are probably going to still exist above 8, 9, 10,000 feet. What we've seen in the last few years, some of these assessments need to be made with modeling. And particularly if someone gets really focused on doing big studies in the Colorado River Basin, you need to assess the runoff from each one of these individual projects. Is that really adding up to a sum total positive effect in the lower stem of the river? And as I mentioned before, you'd really need a more comprehensive project in the upper basin to realize this 5 to 10% increase in runoff that the feasibility studies indicated. And I think I'll stop there and see if you have questions.
All right, we have a few minutes for questions for our
How
question.
did you monitoring the sulfur pentaoxide, the
I'm sorry?
SF6? How do you monitor this SF6?
Well, we don't use it anymore. That became non-environmentally friendly. We were using that in the 80s and 90s, and there's a special instrument that was created just to measure that particular compound.
Infrared?
Well, it actually used, had a small bit of radiation detector that, I don't know if it excited the molecule or what it did, but that's how it was measuring. It was a very fast response instrument, and you could get a 1-second time resolution of the concentration of SF6. But folks don't like you to use fluoride compounds anymore.
Other questions? Dave?
Did you do any down gradient humidity diminishment experiments? That's the scientific question. And the political question is, with all the lawyers in the United States, have you ever considered that cloud seeding upgradient might create lawsuits for people saying you're stealing our transboundary water down gradient in Canada or the east coast of the United States?
I've never heard that question before.
Well, the first scientific question, then, is probably more.
Well, they're directly related, because you won't be able to detect a change in the vapor component of the water budget, because the component that you're affecting by cloud seeding is the liquid water component, which is the smallest component of the liquid, or of the whole water budget. So if you have vapor, if you have ice precipitation, and you have cloud water is the smallest component. And if you remove that component from what you're taking out as precipitation, the change in the overall water budget is basically not measurable. It's a very, very small number. So the potential downwind still exists, because you have almost the same water content ergo what's removed by precipitation and your bit of cloud seeding. But overall, the next mountain barrier downwind is going to have nearly the same potential for creating a storm as what you did on your upwind barrier, minus 30% for precip. The other part of that is we have looked at precipitation trends on the upwind sides of barriers and the downwind sides of barriers and seen no detectable change, say in Reno's precip versus Tahoe City's precip, or out in the middle of Nevada, the Sierra Nevada precip versus the precip out in Austin. One, they're not very well correlated because they're generally affected by two different types of storm systems. But there's no change over the period, say the 50 years prior to any seeding being conducted versus the latest 50 years when there was. There's no detectable change in what's going on downwind.
A quick follow-up. If you're taking out approximately 1 million acre-feet in the Colorado Basin, or had the potential to do that, you said that's a minute amount of the overall air budget annually. I have no conception of what the overall air budget for vapor would be. Would you have that number? Just
well, let me put it in terms of liquid water. I've never measured the vapor budget, but in terms of liquid water, we use radiometers to measure the flux of liquid water over a mountain barrier over the course of a winter, and found that what escapes downwind, what forms as liquid but never is part of the precip process and evaporates downwind, is nearly equivalent to the average runoff in the basin. And that's just the liquid phase of the water budget. And vapor is generally 10 times, just based on radiometer measurements, vapor is generally 10 or more times what the liquid phase is. So millions of acre feet in liquid and 10 times that in vapor.
Thank you.
We had someone calling in actually with a question. Lynn, are you there, Lynn?
Hi, yes,
Hi,
I am.
and I think you might have answered a question, but I'll let her ask it anyways. Go ahead, Lynn.
Hi, yes, I think he did answer the question, and it was just a simple question of if you cloud seed in one area, is this going to have a negative impact in a downwind area?
And what we've generally seen, the one-word answer is no. In the immediate downwind end, I'll qualify this a little bit, because if you're seeding on the upwind side and your target's in the high terrain, those ice crystals aren't necessarily going to stop at the crest. So you can actually get a small increase. And some of the statistical studies have showed the biggest increase obviously being on the upwind side, but a little carryover on the downwind side in the next basin over. So you aren't necessarily decreasing, you may be increasing or enhancing it slightly.
Thank you.
Zane?
Could you speak to the economic feasibility of this? What's the unit volume cost for producing certain?
You know, I had my one slide I went through really quickly for the Utah projects, and what they estimate in terms of acre feet of water produced by cloud seeding, and basically just divide the cost by the number of acre feet, or vice versa, acre feet by the cost. And they think they can produce the additional water for $8 to $12 an acre foot. I've made similar estimates on our Nevada projects, and ours tend to be a little higher, but somewhere in the vicinity of $10 to $20 an acre foot for the augmented snow water.
Other questions for Arlen? All right. Well, please join me in thanking Arlen. And thank you all for coming. So have a good day.